Hey guys, and welcome to Bullshit Games. I am Andrew, and today I'm going to be talking about science fiction once again. But instead of talking about like a series or a particular genre within science fiction, or a meta-genre within science fiction, or even a book, a particular book, I'm going to be talking about some of the arguments that are within science fiction itself, some of the critical context, some of the, I guess you could say, more academic side of science fiction. And to start that out, I want to go into science fiction's role right now in academia, where it stands as not only something people read for entertainment, but as something people read for the ideas that are transmuted throughout the genre itself, and also the historical context throughout the genre, and I guess you could say even the importance of the genre. I think that for the most part, literary groups, as far as literary groups go, and as far as literature goes, science fiction and fantasy are very commonly kind of pushed aside. Like, well, that's a juvenile literature. That's not important. And that's been the case for a long time now. It's changed quite a bit because more people are starting to study science fiction seriously. More people are starting to see the merit of science fiction as not only, genre fiction, not only as something that's a fandom, but also as something that is culturally and critically important as far as literature goes. Now, some of it is. There is some that, there are always, and that goes with anything. Like, I think as far as any, book, there's always going to be some books that are not that good and some books that are good. And that is definitely the case with science fiction. There are some wonderful, great books out there that are, in my opinion, probably some of the most important pieces of fiction ever written. But then there are some that are just not that great. I'm not going to get into any specifics on it, but there are a lot of science fiction stories and books and series that just aren't that good. Not badly written and not necessarily bad stories, just not what you would think of as being something that's critically important. There are some wonderful stories out there that are just, are not about anything but the subject of the story, which is fine. I think that's important to have because, I guess escapism is, a lot of people will say, well, you shouldn't be into escapism and the escapist books, but I think everybody needs a little bit of escapism now and then. I think, reality gets kind of heavy sometimes. It's nice to read about, aliens on the moons of Jupiter or something like that, or, the hobbits in the Shire, and things of that nature. And, I use Lord of the Rings as an example there, but that's not necessarily completely escapist either. There's a lot of interesting themes throughout that book. But today, as a side note, that is, to get back on course now, I'll talk, more about science fiction and some of the books I have that are on critical theory within science fiction. I've actually had a chance to study science fiction as, critically study in college. I had a class about 2 years ago that was Masters of Science Fiction, which is an amazing class. We read some amazing stories, and you got into some of the really interesting ideas that are transmitted throughout science fiction. And I'll give you an example of some of the books that I have personally that give me good at me. They're great, not only as theory within science fiction, but also pretty good reads, and they're really well written. But this one is Speculations on Speculation, Theories of Science Fiction. This is kind of an anthology of many different essays from many different people. There are essays from James Gunn. There are essays from Samuel R. Delany. There's a few from Darko Suvin, who's probably one of the biggest science fiction critics there is out there. And this book honestly focuses on what science fiction actually is. What separates science fiction from other genres, other types of literature, other things of that nature. And basically I like Suvin's argument the most, which he basically argues that science fiction is composed of basically cognitive estrangement. So in other words, you can understand how this could happen. This could possibly happen. Now, that's taking it to I mean, there's a lot of science fiction out there where it's like, well, that couldn't happen, but it is still believable. It's still within the natural laws of the universe. Things are scientifically explained, so you can relate to that. A good thing to compare that with would be to not necessarily let's say Lord of the Rings. Magic, as we know it, is not possible. There's no way to explain magic. It's not like a thing where you can point out and go, well, if you make an equation of x plus x, it could equal, fire coming out of my hands. It's something that's imaginary, something that's, mythic. It's separate from science fiction, because science fiction, there might be something like that, but you would have to explain it to a certain extent. You have to make it believable to a certain extent. Not completely believable, because if it was completely believable, then, well, science fiction would probably lose a lot of what makes it science fiction. So, in other words, if, say, I think a good example would be like Starship Troopers. The prospect of a bug-like civilization existing on a different galaxy, that's plausible. Is it true? Is it really out there? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But it is plausible. This could possibly happen. Is it going to? No. But it is something that you can recognize as being possible. Where fantasy is, for the most part, not possible. I mean, yeah, I think that's the best way to explain it there. I mean, fantasy is magical. Fantasy is unreal. I mean, fantasy, you have a flying carpet, where it doesn't need explaining. It's a flying carpet. It's magical. It just flies. You don't ask questions about it. But if you have a flying carpet in science fiction, as a reader, you're going to go, wait a minute, this is not science fiction. It's just the way the reader comprehends what is going on. When you see that magic flying carpet, you don't think this is science fiction. You think this is fantasy. But if that's explained, let's say it's a carpet that has a anti-gravity mechanism on it that allows it to float, okay, then it's science fiction. Then you have science fiction. It's not explained in detail to where you're like, wow, that's true, that actually happened, but it's explained. It can't just be left to magic. It has to have somewhat of an explanation. And that's basically what most of this is about. There are also a few others. Delaney's argument is very similar to Darko Suvin's. I think Suvin's is a little bit more cohesive. I think it is encompasses more. I think if you use his argument, I think you can bring more into the genre that isn't necessarily thought of as being in the genre. You can go, well, by this, it is science fiction. With 1984, for example, there have been a lot of arguments, people saying, well, this isn't science fiction. It's political commentary on what was going on in the 1940s and during the World War II in Russia or in Germany with fascism, or in Russia with communism. Which, yes, there is that. There's most definitely that aspect to the book. But there's also the fact that the book is set in 1984, a futuristic setting at the time. It's not now, obviously, but at the time it was a futuristic setting. And there's also the fact that there's a lot of technology throughout 1984 that wasn't prominent in the 1940s. Was it there? Yeah. Were the ideas there? Yeah. But those ideas were taken to the next level and speculated upon. And I've always felt that is another aspect of science fiction is the speculation part. Are you speculating on the future? And it's not always the case. And these arguments are always very, you can take them one way or another. There are some science fiction, there is a lot of science fiction that kind of bends that definition. I guess a good example would be Star Wars. And what is Star Wars? Can you really consider Star Wars to be science fiction? I mean, there's the Force, which is basically another word for magic. It's almost completely unexplained other than, well, they did kind of in the first movie with like the midichlorians. But generally, it's just kind of like a spiritual. In the original 3, 4, 5, and 6, the Force was a spiritual thing. It wasn't something that you could really explain. It wasn't anything like that. It was the Force. It was something that you tapped into that was something out there. So that aspect of Star Wars, when you think about it, really is not science fiction. But then at the same time, you have, hyperdrive, you have intergalactic wars, you have the whole setting is in space, basically, so you have a mixture of the two, and it's like, well, what is this? And that's kind of how you get space opera. Space opera kind of gets grouped in with this one entity where it's science fiction, but at the same time, there's a lot of stuff that's not science fiction in it. And, I could go much more into depth with that, but yeah, I think that's an interesting thing. I mean, I guess I'll pose that question to you guys right now. Would you argue that that Star Wars is science fiction because, or is it space fantasy, or would you say it's, I generally stick to what it's called, which is space opera, but I think you could just as easily say, well, it's space fantasy. It's fantasy with science fiction themes throughout. You could say that. You could also say, well, they explained the Force to a certain extent in the first movie, Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. And it's the midichlorians or whatever, so it's science fiction. They explained it, not very well, but they did try to explain it. So we can let them get away with calling it science fiction. But that's just part of it. That's just part of the argument. And, I have another book that is by Samuel R. Delany, which is The Jewel-Hinged Jaw, and sorry for the glare on there. But, this is The Jewel-Hinged Jaw, Notes on the Language of Science Fiction, and this is full of critical essays and some things like that. And one thing I'll say about Delany is that he has done a lot to legitimize science fiction as a literary genre, not as just something that's not serious at all and something that kids read on the weekends, but something that really deals with social and political and issues of import. And the third book I have that is also really great, which is just generally a mashup of a bunch of different essays by a bunch of different people, is, sorry about the glare, science fiction, the Cambridge Companion to. This is the Cambridge Companion to Science Fiction. This is obviously they're edited by Cambridge University Press, and I should go through this. This one is Wesleyan University Press, who published this one, Jewel-Hinged Jaw, and Speculations on Speculation is Scarecrow Press. So I think I should probably do that just to make sure with the copyright laws and things of that nature. But anyways, science fiction is still gaining steam. I personally read science fiction very critically. I think that there are a lot of ideas that are dealt with. Just thinking about when the majority of science fiction was written, which was basically from, when you really look at, here I'll go on a little bit of a tangent, but some people argue that science fiction started with like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which I guess within a certain context, I could see how that could be considered science fiction. Some people have even gone as far back as stating that I think it's Sir Thomas More's Utopia was the first work of science fiction. And I have seen some others too that even go farther back than that. I'll be the first to say that I usually start with Wells. I usually start with H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds, The Invisible Man, things of that nature. I always considered him to be the first, not necessarily the first science fiction, the first of what we would think of as being like genre science fiction. Science fiction where you can really see the difference in science fiction and fantasy, or science fiction and fictional literature. I would say that is where it generally starts. Not really, I wouldn't peg it on him as being the first science fiction writer, because there are people who have argued that Jules Verne is, and his stuff is very science fiction also, but I've always felt was more Victorian, where Wells is, and if you read the two, you can tell the differences. I think it's something subconsciously as a reader you do when you're reading something like that, because it's not just like, I like Jules Verne a lot, but you can tell the difference between him and H.G. Wells. They're very different. They're very differently written, and Wells really explains almost everything. The time machine, for example. I mean, and there's absolutely zero scientific plausibility to how the time machine works in H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. But the fact that it is a machine, the fact that it is a mechanism that is built and explained to a certain extent, it is science fiction. So even though we know that it's not possible, because he took the time to explain that, it is then considered science fiction. But yeah, when you look at that time frame of when this genre really started coming out, which was around 1900 throughout pretty much the 80s, is when you got really the majority of science fiction was written. And there's a lot of science fiction written today, don't get me wrong. But when you think of like the periods in which it was really popular, in which there was a lot of really great stuff coming out, you have that time period, that sort of range. And this time period is dominated by war. You have the First World War, the Second World War, you have the Cold War, and all the wars that have to do with the Cold War. Vietnam, things of this nature. Wars in which weapons technology was used, was a main part of these wars. Machine guns, tanks, airplanes, things of this nature. And then later on in the Cold War, you have surveillance, you have the atom bomb, nuclear weapons, and science fiction is dominated by the fear of the bomb. Everywhere you see that, from Bradbury to, you name it, it's there. There's the fear of the bomb. So yeah, that's a big part of science fiction also. And then you get up into the 80s, where you have cyberpunk, which gets very popular. And during the 60s, you have the new wave movement, which has more of a social overtone to it compared to the 50s, where it was very, I don't want to say militaristic, but very technological, very hard science fiction. And you have the new wave during the 60s, which focuses more on the social sciences compared to the hard sciences. Then you get in the 80s, in the 70s, and you start having cyberpunk, and you have the digital age coming forth, and all these things really deal with a lot of social and political issues that were going on at the time. So reading them within historical context is always important, and I think that's with anything. But seeing as how I have rambled on for about 18 minutes, I'm going to probably end this video there. I hope you guys liked this video. I know it's kind of different than what I usually do, but it's one of those things where I'm kind of passionate about. I really love science fiction. I like to study it, which some people might think that's kind of ridiculous, but I think it's worthwhile, and I think it's something that should be studied and read critically rather than just read and then tossed aside as, well, that was something great. And I think fantasy deserves that same honor, and I think graphic novels deserve that same honor also. But, yeah, if you have any comments on this, the definition of science fiction, there are a lot of other definitions out there. I just happen to agree with Dr. Subin's the most. I kind of have thought of my own definition for it, but I won't get into that right now. But yeah, that's it. Like and comment if you like this video. If you want to see more of this kind of stuff, subscribe. We also talk about board games, tabletop games, gaming, obviously cool shit games. So we talk about games a lot. So yeah, thanks for your time and have a good day.